China is facing some major economic problems, and this is likely going to have reverberating effects throughout the world that will impact the economies of the West and possibly multiple security situations. Now, an immediate look doesn't look so bad, but China's likely only going to have 5% economic growth this year. For a Western economy, say the US, the UK, or France, that would be fantastic. But for China, that's actually really bad and low numbers because the amount of people that they're trying to draw out of poverty before that they have an aging population. Currently, China is actually experiencing deflation, while most of the rest of the world is experiencing inflation. This means the price of goods and services is in decline rather than increasing. Now, that might not sound bad to those of us experiencing worse inflation in the West, but deflation actually leads to a lot of other economic problems, particularly because people can't pay their debts nearly as easily or as well because they make less money. Now, China is especially having problems because of its real estate sector, which makes up 25% of its economy. Apartment sales are actually down 27% year over year, which is a huge deal. And then the massive conglomerate Evergrande has actually posted an $81 billion loss over the last 2 years. So China actually has major structural issues that are problematic in their economy that's leading to less economic growth. So, besides real estate problems, are already bad enough for China, there are major systemic and structural issues within Chinese society and the economy that are going to prevent greater growth over the long term. Now, a critical one, of course, is an aging population. As I mentioned earlier, China's aim is to get wealthy before it gets older, but the one child policy for decades has actually created an inverted pyramid with an excess of tens of millions of males over females in the population as well. So they're unlikely to solve this population issue relatively soon and actually going to experience population decline as they have already started a couple of years ago. Now, some other major issues, of course, are ideological. The zero COVID policy over the last couple of years has really harmed China's ability to operate as a manufacturing hub. Now, you combine that with the arbitrary regulations that the CCP imposes, for example, on data localization, and major companies are less willing to have workers there or use China for what they're wanting. And they're actually trying to quote unquote friend shore. So, this is moving manufacturing to allied countries or countries with less arbitrary regulations that might even target executives that we've seen China do as well. And finally, China has a major debt problem. Now, people think China funds the debt of the West and the US, and they do to a certain extent. But because of the last couple of decades, the way that the Chinese economy has operated, local governments in China have massive amounts of debt that they're not necessarily going to be able to pay back. China's slower economic growth matters to the rest of the world because China has been a critical engine and driver of economic growth globally, especially after the Great Recession. Most of our recovery came because of China. Now, the world is facing economic problems, and although we're still growing a little bit, the WEF has said that we're likely only going to grow 3% over the next couple of years. This is because of the war in Ukraine causing energy problems and certain tech problems, extreme weather events, and higher inflation. So central banks are raising interest rates, which makes it a lot more expensive to borrow money. So this is why we're seeing the kind of recession in the tech sector, because the tech sector relied on very cheap money in order to fund their research that they don't have as much anymore. So that's why we've had major tech layoffs. So China not growing as much is actually going to impact Western economies just as much. Now, depending on how it unfolds, a possible benefit would be a slight decline in inflation without a bottoming out of the economy, which is really what we're always going for, the quote unquote soft landing that central banks seek. Now, China's growth problems can also have security implications because of food insecurity in other places like India or in Africa, or China wanting to take greater control of projects that they've been pushing. The debt issue that I'm sure many people have seen, where China will give out exorbitant loans or take property from countries in order to build infrastructure. China may very well be calling in some of those loans or using a heavier hand in those places. So we could actually see conflict develop because of this as well. So even though China is still growing a little bit, they have major structural issues that they have to resolve. They're unlikely to. And so the rest of the world is going to have negative consequences economically and on security grounds as well.